The year is 1864. The air in the Tennessee hills is thick with the damp chill of late autumn and the suffocating tension of a nation tearing itself apart. For a lone traveler, a Confederate deserter named Thomas Finch, the darkening woods are both a sanctuary and a prison. His uniform is tattered, his stomach a hollow ache, and his mind a gallery of horrors from the battlefields of the Cumberland Gap. For 2 days he has chewed on roots and bark, his desperation growing with each rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth. Then through a break in the ancient gnarled trees he sees it, a pinprick of orange light, a cabin hope, or perhaps something far worse, flickers in his chest. The structure is little more than a dark silhouette against the bruised purple of the twilight sky, a thread of smoke coiling from its stone chimney like a ghostly finger. Caution battles with exhaustion. This deep in the backcountry, loyalties were fluid, and a stranger was often met with the cold steel of a rifle before a warm greeting. But the gnawing hunger is a more immediate threat than any mountain farmer. He approaches slowly, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of decaying leaves. The cabin is small, crudely built, with windows like vacant eyes. As he draws closer, a low, rhythmic sound reaches him, a methodical, wet chopping. It's not the sound of wood being split. It is heavier, softer, more organic. Thomas Finch freezes, his hand instinctively going to the empty holster at his side. The chopping sound continues, steady and unnerving. He creeps toward the single illuminated window, its glass grimy and warped. Peering through a clear patch, his blood runs cold. Inside, bathed in the flickering firelight, a woman stands with her back to him. She is gaunt, her dress a patchwork of faded calico. Before her, on a thick butcher's block, lies something. It is pale and indistinct in the shifting shadows, but its shape is disturbingly familiar. The woman raises a heavy cleaver. It comes down with a sickening thud, the sound echoing the frantic beat of Thomas's own heart. He can't see exactly what she is carving, but he sees the crimson that stains the block, her hands, and the front of her apron. He sees a small pile of what looks like discarded clothing in the corner, a blue Union coat among them. He stifles a gasp, the air catching in his throat like a fishhook. This is no place of salvation, it is a place of butchery. A small child, a girl with wide, vacant eyes, watches her mother work, her expression not of horror but of placid expectation. Thomas stumbles back, his mind screaming. He turns and flees into the suffocating darkness of the woods, the macabre scene burned into his memory. He doesn't know what he witnessed, but he knows it was a forbidden, unholy act. He had stumbled upon the cursed hollow of the widow Blackwood, and the chilling story of what happened there was just beginning. Before the war, before the hunger and the darkness, the cabin in Blackwood Hollow was a home. It was built by John Blackwood, a man as sturdy and quiet as the oaks that surrounded his land. He and his wife Elara had carved out a life from the unforgiving Tennessee soil. Elara was not born to the mountains. She came from a slightly more genteel life in a small town, a life she left behind for love. Her hands, once accustomed to needlepoint, learned to till soil and salt meat. They had 2 children, a boy Silas, strong like his father, and a girl Maeve, quiet and watchful like her mother. Their life was not easy, but it was their own, governed by the seasons and insulated from the growing political storm that was gathering over the nation. The whispers of secession and war were distant thunder, a problem for city folk and plantation owners. Here, survival was the only allegiance that mattered, but the war did not respect geography. In the spring of 1862, Confederate conscription officers rode through the hills, their papers as binding as iron shackles. John Blackwood, a man who owned no slaves and had no quarrel with the Union, was forced to leave his home and fight for a cause he barely understood. Elara's world, once small but secure, began to collapse. The last time she saw her husband, he was a silhouette on the ridge, turning back one final time to wave before the forest swallowed him whole. For 2 years, Elara held on. She worked the small plot of land with a ferocity born of desperation. Silas, barely a boy, took on the chores of a man. They survived on what they could grow, hunt, or forage. News from the outside world came in scraps delivered by traveling tinkers or weary soldiers passing through. The news was always grim, tales of battles with horrifying names like Shiloh and Antietam, of staggering losses and endless bloodshed. Elara would listen, her face a stone mask, always asking if they had word of the 37th Tennessee Infantry. Most just shook their heads. The war bled the land dry. Bushwhackers and deserters from both armies roamed the hills, preying on isolated homesteads. The already thin bonds of community frayed into suspicion and fear. Every neighbor became a potential threat, every stranger a harbinger of violence. Elara taught her children the hard math of survival. Trust no one, show nothing, save everything. Her home, once a place of warmth, became a fortress. She barred the door at night and kept John's old hunting rifle loaded and ready by her side. The hollow that had once been their sanctuary was now their cage, and the encroaching wilderness seemed to watch with a hungry, waiting patience. The hope she had clung to for John's return began to wither, replaced by a cold, pragmatic dread. The letter arrived in the summer of 1864, carried by a circuit preacher making his rounds. It was not an official military correspondence, but a page torn from a ledger, written in the clumsy hand of a fellow soldier. The paper was smudged with dirt and something darker. The words were simple, brutal, and stripped of all sentiment. John Blackwood had fallen during the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain in Georgia. He was buried where he lay in an unmarked grave, one of thousands of forgotten souls consumed by the conflict. The preacher offered his condolences in a prayer, but his words were empty sounds against the roaring silence in Elara's ears. She did not weep. The capacity for such tears had been scoured out of her long ago. Instead, a terrifying stillness settled over her. She thanked the preacher, gave him a cup of water, and sent him on his way. That night, as her children slept, she burned the letter. She watched the paper blacken and curl into ash, taking with it the last remnants of the woman she used to be. The love, the hope, the grief, it was all fuel now. All that remained was a single, chilling purpose, the survival of her children. The coming winter was predicted to be the harshest in memory, and she was a widow alone with 2 mouths to feed and a world that had abandoned her. Something inside her broke, or perhaps was forged into something new and horrifying. The curse of the widow was not supernatural. It was born in that fire, in the ashes of a forgotten soldier's last testament. As autumn stripped the leaves from the trees, leaving skeletal branches clawing at a gray sky, the true desperation began. The meager harvest was not enough. The squirrels and rabbits they had relied on seemed to have vanished, hunted to near extinction by starving families. The community, once a network of mutual support, had become a collection of isolated, hungry islands. When Alara went to the nearest settlement for supplies, she was met with empty shelves and suspicious eyes. Her husband was dead, her resources gone. She was a burden, another mouth in a land of starvation. The whispers started then, quiet, venomous things that slithered through the hollows. People noticed that while their own children grew thin and pale, Sela's and Maeve Blackwood retained a strange, unsettling vitality. Their cheeks were not as hollow, their eyes not as haunted. It defied logic. Alara rarely left her land, and no one ever saw her bring back game. Where was the food coming from? Superstition, a constant companion in these isolated hills, began to provide its own dark answers. They said the Blackwood land was soured, that Alara was practicing old, forbidden mountain magic to sustain her family. They called her a witch, a word that carried the weight of a death sentence. She was no longer just a widow, she was an outcast, a figure of macabre folklore in the making. And as the first snows began to fall, blanketing the hills in a sterile white shroud, the first traveler vanished near Blackwood Hollow. He was a Union scout, separated from his patrol, his blue uniform a stark target in the gray woods. He was seen asking for directions at a farm a few miles from the Blackwood property, complaining of a twisted ankle. He was never seen again. In a time of war, a single missing soldier was hardly a mystery. Men vanished every day, victims of enemy action, desertion, or the unforgiving wilderness. No official search was launched, but the locals knew. They marked his disappearance, another strange event orbiting the dark star of Alara Blackwood's homestead. A few weeks later, a pair of Confederate deserters, hopping to make their way north, passed through the area. They were rough men, dangerous and desperate. They too vanished without a trace. It was their disappearance that truly cemented the legend. These were not men who would simply get lost. They were survivors, capable and cruel. For them to be swallowed by the hills so completely, so close to the widow's cabin, felt unnatural. The whispers grew louder, evolving into a full-blown narrative of a curse. The story went that Alara, in her grief and rage, had made a pact with something ancient and malevolent that dwelt deep in the woods. She had traded her soul, and in return, the land around her cabin had been given a sinister power. It was said the hollow itself had become hungry, luring in the lost and the weary, and that Alara was its keeper. The story was a way to explain the unexplainable, to give a face to the creeping dread that had settled over the region. The curse, as the mountain folk called it, began to manifest in other ways. A farmer whose land bordered the Blackwood property reported that his prize hog had been found slain, its body strangely drained and its choicest parts carved away. Another family claimed a blight had crept from the edge of Alara's woods into their cornfield, turning the stalks black and rot. Children were forbidden from playing near the creek that flowed down from her hollow, told that the water was poisoned by her dark dealings. Alara became a phantom. She was rarely seen, and when she was, it was a fleeting glimpse of a gaunt figure moving through the trees at dusk, her presence feeling more like a haunting than a human encounter. The fear she inspired was palpable. It created a dead zone around her property, an invisible wall that no one dared to cross. This isolation, born of fear, ironically became her greatest shield. No one was brave enough to confront her, to ask her where she got her food or what happened to the men who had vanished. They were content to let the mystery remain, to whisper their horrifying theories from a safe distance. The truth they feared was something no sane person would want to witness. And so Alara and her children remained in their fortress of dread, their strange survival a constant, macabre spectacle for the starving communities that surrounded them. The widow of Blackwood Hollow was no longer just a woman. She had become a local ghost story, a cautionary tale told to frighten children and unnerve grown men. Inside the cabin, the world of curses and folklore held no sway. There was only the stark, brutal reality of survival. The children, Silas and Maeve, lived in a world remade by their mother's will. Their memories of their father and the time before the hunger were fading, replaced by a new, grim routine. They understood the new rules implicitly. They did not speak of the visitors. They did not ask where the salted meat in the cellar came from. They did not question why their mother sometimes spent long nights scrubbing the cabin's floorboards with lye and sand until her knuckles were raw. Their silence was not born of fear of their mother, but of a deep, instinctual understanding that their continued existence depended on it. They were her accomplices, her silent partners in a crime they could not name. Maeve, the younger of the two, would often sit by the fire, humming quietly to herself as she stitched together pieces of mismatched cloth taken from a small pile in the corner. Silas, older and more aware, would focus on his chores, his face set in a permanent stoic mask. He would chop wood, haul water, and stand watch from the edge of the woods, his eyes scanning the tree line not for game, but for the approach of anyone who did not belong. There was a disturbing maturity in them, a loss of innocence that was perhaps the most macabre element of the entire situation. They were children who had been forced to accept a horrifying new reality as normal, their moral compass shattered and rebuilt around a single, savage principle: eat or be eaten. The story of the Blackwood Curse could have remained just that, a local legend, a piece of macabre folklore destined to fade with time. But the number of the vanished continued to grow, and the tale began to leak out of the isolated hollows and into the more populated towns. It was carried by traveling merchants, by soldiers on leave, by families fleeing the ravages of the war. With each retelling, the story grew more elaborate and horrifying. Some versions claimed Alara could change her shape, luring men into the woods in the guise of a beautiful woman. Others said she commanded a pack of phantom wolves that did her bidding. The most disturbing tales, however, were the ones that whispered of cannibalism, of unholy feasts held in the dead of winter. The story became a forbidden history, a dark chapter in the region's already bloody chronicle. It is stories like these, buried by time and shame, that we seek to unearth. These are the tales that lie in the dark corners of our past, too disturbing for conventional history books. If you find yourself drawn to these forbidden narratives and want to ensure more of them are brought into the light, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. The deeper we dig into the case of the widow Blackwood, the more unsettling the discoveries become, and you won't want to miss the horrifying truth that lies at the bottom of this cold case. The legend was about to attract the attention of someone who didn't believe in curses, but who did believe in the evil that men and women do. His name was Jebediah Thorne, a former circuit judge who had lost his position and his family to the war. He now made a living as a bounty hunter and private investigator, a grim profession for a grim time. Thorne was a man stripped of all sentimentality, a pragmatist who saw the world not in shades of good and evil, but of predator and prey. He heard the tale of the Blackwood Curse in a saloon in Knoxville, and it piqued his interest not for its supernatural elements but for its consistency. Too many people had vanished in the same small area. Curses didn't make people disappear, people did. He saw a pattern, and patterns suggested a solvable human problem. He believed the stories were a cloak of superstition thrown over a series of methodical, calculated crimes. Against the advice of the locals, who viewed his quest as a death wish, Thorne decided to travel to the mountains to investigate the curse himself. He was not a man easily intimidated by folklore. He had seen the real horrors of war, the depths of human depravity that needed no supernatural explanation. A lonely widow in the hills seemed a far less daunting foe than a line of charging infantry. He packed his saddlebags, checked his Colt revolver, and rode out towards the place the locals called the Devil's Hollow, determined to unravel the macabre mystery of Alara Blackwood. He was looking for a killer, not a witch, but he could not possibly be prepared for the disturbing truth he was about to uncover. Thorne began his investigation methodically. He did not ride directly to the Blackwood cabin. Instead, he spent weeks in the surrounding settlements interviewing families, buying drinks for gossips, and listening to the stories. He collected the names of the vanished, cross-referencing dates and last known locations. He was a patient man, weaving together the disparate threads of rumor and fact. He learned about the Union scout, the Confederate deserters, and a traveling preacher who had been making his way through the mountains and had never reached his destination. He discovered that at least 3 other men, a trapper, a land surveyor, and a young man looking for work, had all been reported missing in the same vicinity over the past year. A pattern emerged. All the victims were men, all were traveling alone, and all had vanished within a 5-mile radius of Alara Blackwood's property. The folklore claimed the hollow itself was cursed, that it would swallow travelers whole. Thorne saw a different kind of trap, a predator's hunting ground. He noted the locals' descriptions of Alara's children, how they remained healthy while others starved. It all pointed to a single, horrifying conclusion that the locals were too afraid to voice directly. The widow had a source of sustenance that no one could account for, and a steady stream of lonely travelers were providing it. Thorne's investigation led him to a reclusive old hunter named Silas Croft, one of the few men who had dared to venture near the Blackwood property after the curse had taken hold. Croft was a man of the mountains, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes sharp and knowing. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or superstitious fear. Initially reluctant to speak, he eventually opened up to Thorne over a bottle of corn whiskey. Croft confessed that, troubled by the rumors and the strange health of the Blackwood children, he had done his own quiet reconnaissance a few months prior. He hadn't seen any spirits or demons. What he had seen was far more unsettling. From a concealed position on a ridge overlooking the cabin, he watched Alara and her son Silas drag something heavy from the woods. It was wrapped in a canvas tarp, but from its shape and weight, Croft knew it was the body of a man. He watched them haul it not to a grave, but towards a small, dilapidated smokehouse behind the cabin. Later that night, he saw the smoke rise from its chimney, thick and greasy, carrying a scent that was sickeningly sweet. It was not the smell of curing ham or venison. It was a smell he had encountered only once before on a battlefield where the dead had been burned in a mass pyre. The memory had haunted him ever since. He told Thorn that he left immediately, his courage failing him. He knew then that what was happening in that hollow was not witchcraft, but something far more primal and deeply disturbing. Armed with Croft's horrifying testimony, Jebediah Thorn knew he could not delay any longer. He planned his approach to the Blackwood cabin with the precision of a military strategist. He would not go in broad daylight, nor would he announce his presence. He decided to observe the homestead for at least one full day from a hidden vantage point, just as the hunter had done. He wanted to understand the family's routine, their defenses, and their secrets. He found a rocky outcrop that offered a clear view of the cabin and the surrounding clearing, concealing himself within a thicket of rhododendron. For hours he lay motionless, watching the grim tableau unfold below. He saw Alara, a specter of a woman, moving with an eerie, efficient grace. He saw the boy Silas patrolling the perimeter of the property with an old rifle, his movements not those of a child, but of a seasoned sentry. He saw the girl Maeve sitting on the porch, her gaze fixed on the tree line, a silent, watchful sentinel. There was a chilling sense of order and discipline to their existence. This was not a family struggling to survive. This was a unit operating with a cold, practiced lethality. The entire homestead was a perfectly designed trap, from its isolated location to the disarming image of a widow and her children. Thorn realized he was not just investigating a series of murders. He was observing a finely tuned, predatory machine. As dusk settled, Thorn witnessed something that confirmed his darkest suspicions. A man on horseback appeared on the trail leading to the hollow. He was a peddler, his horse laden with goods. He looked lost and weary. Alara emerged from the cabin, her posture changing from one of guarded tension to that of a welcoming, humble homesteader. She offered the man a drink of water, a place to rest his horse, a warm meal. It was a practiced, convincing performance. The peddler, grateful and unsuspecting, accepted her offer and followed her inside. Thorn's heart pounded in his chest. He was now a witness. He considered his options. He could storm the cabin now, but he was one man against what he now knew were at least two capable and likely armed individuals inside. A direct confrontation was too risky. He decided to wait for the cover of deep night. He would approach the cabin when they were asleep, investigate the smokehouse and the root cellar Croft had mentioned, and gather the irrefutable evidence he needed before confronting them or fetching help. As he waited in the growing darkness, the silence of the hollow was broken by a single, sharp, muffled cry from within the cabin. Then an unnerving silence returned, deeper and more absolute than before. The trap had been sprung. Thorn knew with chilling certainty that the peddler would not be leaving Blackwood Hollow alive. The creepy curse was no legend. It was a horrifying, ongoing reality. Under the sliver of a cold moon, Jebediah Thorn moved like a ghost through the trees. Every snapped twig sounded like a gunshot in the profound silence. He bypassed the cabin, his focus entirely on the outbuildings, the smokehouse and the root cellar. The smokehouse was his first target. Its door was crudely made, secured with a simple wooden latch. He lifted it slowly, the wood groaning in protest. The air that hit him was thick, cloying, and foul. It was the smell of old blood and rancid fat, a butcher's aroma gone horribly wrong. Inside, hanging from the rafters, were not sides of bacon or venison. They were long, pale strips of something else, wrapped in cheesecloth. In the dim light, he couldn't be certain, but their size and shape were horrifyingly suggestive. On a table below, he saw knives, saws, and a cleaver, all meticulously cleaned but stained dark at the handles. The floor was packed earth, but he could see darker patches where it had been repeatedly soaked with fluid. It was a workshop of human disassembly. The sheer pragmatism of the place was what chilled him most. This was not the work of a frenzied madwoman, but of a practiced, methodical processor. He backed out slowly, carefully closing the door, his mind reeling from the macabre evidence. The folklore had spoken of a curse that consumed flesh. The reality was a system of harvest and preservation. Next, Thorn moved to the root cellar. The entrance was a heavy wooden door set at an angle into the earth, covered with leaves and brush in a crude attempt at camouflage. It took all his strength to lift it without making a sound. A wave of cool, damp air washed over him, carrying the scent of soil and rot. He lit a small tallow candle, its flickering flame casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the stone walls as he descended the narrow steps. The cellar was larger than he expected. On one side were shelves lined with jars of preserved vegetables, a meager and pathetic display. But the other side of the cellar was what held his attention. There were piles of clothing, sorted and folded. He recognized the peddler's jacket on top of one heap. In another, he saw the faded blue of a Union uniform and the butternut gray of a Confederate shell jacket. And then he saw the personal effects, a small mountain of them. Leather wallets, pocket watches, tintypes of smiling wives and children, letters from home, military medals, a silver locket, a worn Bible with the name Samuel Parris embossed in gold leaf. It was a museum of the vanished, a collection of lives all ended here in this cold, dark hole. This was the irrefutable proof he sought. Alara Blackwood was not just a killer, she was a collector, a keeper of trophies from her silent, one-sided war for survival. The weight of the discovery was crushing. Each item represented a person, a story, a world of hope and despair that had been extinguished and rendered down to its component parts. Thorn heard a sound from above, the creak of a floorboard in the cabin. He immediately extinguished his candle, plunging the cellar into absolute blackness. His heart hammered against his ribs. Had he been discovered? He drew his Colt, the metallic click of the hammer being cocked seeming to echo endlessly in the confined space. He stood motionless, listening, his senses on high alert. He could hear footsteps moving across the cabin floor above him, slow and deliberate. Then the sound of the cabin door opening. He held his breath. Was she coming for him, or was she merely checking on her property, a nightly ritual of a predator securing its lair? Minutes stretched into an eternity. He imagined Alara standing in the moonlight, her eyes scanning the darkness, her senses attuned to any disturbance. He was trapped. If he tried to leave the cellar, he would be completely exposed. His only option was to wait, to hope that she would return inside and that he had not given himself away. The silence returned, thick and oppressive. After what felt like an hour, he dared to creep back up the stone steps and peek out. The clearing was empty. The cabin was dark and silent once more. He had not been detected. Shaken but resolute, he knew he could not stay. He had the evidence he needed. He had to get back to town, to bring back the law, or at least a posse of men brave enough to face the monster in Blackwood Hollow. He slipped away from the homestead, melting back into the woods, the horrifying images from the cellar and smokehouse forever seared into his mind. The journey back to the nearest town was a frantic, paranoid ordeal. Thorn felt as though the woods themselves were watching him, that Alara Blackwood's presence extended far beyond her small clearing. He imagined her moving through the trees with supernatural speed, hunting him as she had hunted so many others. He didn't stop to rest, pushing his horse and himself to the point of exhaustion. When he finally rode into the dusty main street of the town, he was a specter of a man, his face pale and his eyes wide with what he had witnessed. He went straight to the sheriff, a weary, war-battered man named Calloway. Thorn laid out his story, not the folklore of curses, but the cold, hard facts. The smokehouse, the cellar, the peddler's jacket, the mountain of personal effects belonging to the vanished. Sheriff Calloway listened, his initial skepticism slowly melting away into a grim understanding. He had heard the whispers about the Blackwood widow for months, dismissing them as ignorant superstition. But Thorn was not a superstitious man, and the evidence he described was chillingly concrete. The sheriff knew he could not ignore it. The war had brought enough lawlessness to his county. This, however, was a different kind of evil, a creeping sickness that had taken root in the hills. He agreed to assemble a posse. They would ride out at dawn. The curse of the widow Blackwood was about to face a reckoning. Word of the posse spread through the town like wildfire. Fear and morbid curiosity drew men from their homes. By dawn, a group of a dozen grim-faced men had gathered in front of the sheriff's office. They were not soldiers, they were farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants, armed with old hunting rifles, shotguns, and a fervent, righteous anger. For too long they had lived in the shadow of the Blackwood curse, whispering its name in fear. Now, guided by the testimony of Jebediah Thorn, their fear had curdled into a desire for justice or perhaps vengeance. Thorn, despite his exhaustion, agreed to lead them. He felt a personal responsibility to see this through to the end. As they rode out of town, a heavy silence fell over the group. They knew they were not just riding to arrest a woman, they were riding to confront a legend, to tear the veil off a local horror story and stare into the face of whatever lay beneath. The journey into the hills was tense. The familiar landscape seemed menacing, every shadow a potential ambush, every gust of wind a sinister whisper. The men who had grown up in these woods now felt like intruders in a forbidden, hostile territory. They were venturing into the heart of a story they had told their children to scare them, and they were beginning to realize that the truth of it might be more horrifying than any fiction they could have imagined. As the posse drew closer to Blackwood Hollow, the men's bravado began to fray. The air grew colder, the woods unnaturally silent. There were no birds chirping, no squirrels rustling in the undergrowth. It was as if all life had fled from this specific patch of land. They dismounted and proceeded on foot, moving through the trees with a clumsy stealth that betrayed their anxiety. Thorn led them to the same ridge he had used for observation. Below, the cabin sat in the morning light, looking deceptively peaceful. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney. Nothing seemed out of place. Sheriff Calloway laid out the plan. They would surround the cabin, block any escape routes, and then call for her to surrender. They wanted to take her alive if possible. They wanted answers. They wanted a confession, a trial, a semblance of order and law to cleanse the stain of her actions. The men fanned out, their rifles held at the ready, their knuckles white. The tension was a physical thing, and not in the stomach of every man present. They were a circle of armed men, slowly closing in on a lone woman and her 2 children, yet it was they who felt like the prey. The psychological power of the legend, the sheer weight of the forbidden acts rumored to have occurred here, was a formidable defense that no bullet could penetrate. Sheriff Calloway stepped into the clearing, his shotgun held loosely at his side. "Alara Blackwood," he yelled, his voice sounding thin in the oppressive silence. "This is Sheriff Calloway. We have you surrounded. Come out with your hands empty." There was no response. The cabin remained silent, the smoke continuing its lazy curl into the sky. "Alara," he called again, louder this time. "Don't make us come in there. We have a warrant for your arrest on suspicion of murder. Come out now." Still nothing. The silence from the cabin was more unnerving than any shout of defiance. The men in the trees exchanged nervous glances. Had she fled? Was she lying in wait, ready to spring an ambush? Thorn, watching from the side, had a sinking feeling. This was too easy. A woman who had survived for so long through such brutal means would not be taken so quietly. He scanned the cabin, the windows like vacant eyes, the tightly shut door. It felt wrong. It felt like a trap. After several more minutes of tense waiting, Sheriff Calloway gave the signal. 2 men were to breach the door while the others provided cover. The dread was now a palpable entity hanging over the clearing. The posse was about to cross a threshold, not just into a cabin, but into the horrifying epicenter of the Blackwood curse. The 2 designated men, their faces slick with sweat, rushed the cabin door. One of them kicked it hard, the wood splintering around the latch. It swung inward with a groan, revealing the dark interior. For a moment, nothing happened. The men peered inside, their rifles raised. Then one of them recoiled, letting out a choked cry, and stumbled backward, his face ashen. The other stood frozen in the doorway, his weapon lowered, his expression one of pure, unadulterated horror. Sheriff Calloway and Thorne rushed forward to see what had paralyzed them. The smell hit them first, the coppery tang of fresh blood mixed with the cloying sweetness of boiled meat and something else, something acrid and chemical like lye. The interior of the one-room cabin was a scene from a slaughterhouse. The floorboards were dark and sticky. A large cast-iron pot sat over the hearth, its contents a thick, bubbling stew from which a pale, vaguely familiar shape protruded. On the butcher's block that Thorne had seen through the window weeks ago lay the half-dismembered corpse of the peddler. But that was not the most horrifying discovery. That was not what had broken the man in the doorway. It was the sight at the small dining table. Seated at the table were Alara Blackwood and her 2 children, Silas and Maeve. They were perfectly still, their postures rigid and formal, as if they were sitting for a church sermon. They were dressed in what appeared to be their finest, albeit worn, clothes. At first glance, it looked as though they were simply waiting, defiant and silent. But their eyes were open too wide, their skin had a waxy, unnatural pallor. On the table, next to a half-eaten bowl of the horrifying stew, was a small uncorked vial of nightshade extract. Alara sat at the head of the table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a faint, almost serene smile on her lips. She had not been taken by surprise. She had known they were coming, and she had chosen her own dark, horrifying exit. She had enacted one final, macabre act of control, sparing her children from the justice of the outside world by delivering her own. The sight was so profoundly disturbing, so utterly outside the bounds of normal human experience that it broke the posse. These were hardened men, familiar with death and violence, but this was a different kind of horror. This was a carefully staged tableau of domestic tranquility twisted into a gruesome suicide pact, the final, defiant statement of the widow Blackwood. The curse had not been broken, it had been fulfilled. The posse was shattered. Some men turned and vomited in the bushes. Others simply stared, their minds unable to process the macabre scene. The righteous anger that had fueled them on their journey had evaporated, replaced by a deep, soul-shaking horror. This was not the simple capture of a criminal. It was a descent into a madness so profound that it seemed to contaminate the very air they breathed. Sheriff Calloway, struggling to maintain his composure, ordered his men to search the property, to document everything before they put the cabin to the torch. He wanted to erase this place from the earth. The search of the smokehouse and the root cellar confirmed everything Jebediah Thorne had reported. They found the gruesome stores of preserved flesh and the heartbreaking collection of personal items from the vanished. They estimated, based on the artifacts, that Alara Blackwood was responsible for the deaths of at least a dozen people, perhaps more. The scale of her predatory survival was staggering. She had turned this small patch of land into a human abattoir, a self-sustaining ecosystem built on murder and cannibalism. The historical context of the Civil War, the starvation, the lawlessness, it all provided a reason, but it could never serve as an excuse. The story of what was found in that cabin would become the most disturbing and forbidden history in the region, a tale told only in hushed, fearful whispers for generations. It's a stark reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural, but are forged in the crucible of human desperation. We explore these dark histories to understand the boundaries of human nature, and if you believe this is important, support our work by hitting the like button. It helps us continue to investigate these chilling, cold cases. Jebediah Thorne stood apart from the others, the scene in the cabin replaying in his mind. He had been so focused on the logic of the crimes, on the pattern of a human predator, that he had failed to consider the psychology of the monster he was hunting. He had viewed Alara Blackwood as a problem to be solved, a puzzle to be pieced together, but she was not a puzzle. She was a woman who had been pushed past the breaking point, her morality eroded by grief and starvation until only a savage maternal instinct remained. Her final act was not one of surrender, but of ultimate protection. In her twisted logic, she was saving her children from a world that would have judged, caged, and ultimately destroyed them. She was preserving her family unit in the only way she had left. Thorne felt a profound and unsettling sense of failure. He had exposed the truth, but what had it accomplished? It had only led to more death. The evil in Blackwood Hollow had not been vanquished by the law, it had simply consumed itself in a final, horrifying act of self-immolation. He wondered about the children, Silas and Maeve. What had they known? What had they become in that isolated, macabre world? their vacant, staring eyes in that final, gruesome tableau would haunt him for the rest of his life. They were victims as much as they were accomplices, their innocence traded away for mouthfuls of forbidden flesh. As the men prepared to burn the cabin, one of the deputies made a final, creepy discovery. Tucked away in a small wooden chest beneath Alara's bed was a journal. Its pages were filled with her elegant, looping handwriting, a stark contrast to the brutality of her life. It was not a diary of her crimes, but something far more disturbing. It was a ledger. Each entry was neat and methodical. It began with the date, followed by a brief description of the person: Union Scout, lame ankle, peddler, goods, deserter, armed. Next to each entry was a precise inventory of what was harvested: boots, good condition; flour, 2 bags; gold watch; rifle, 40 rounds. And then a final, chilling calculation listed under the heading yield, with a number indicating the approximate weight of the meat procured. It was written with the detached, pragmatic tone of a farmer recording livestock. There was no emotion, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the human lives she was extinguishing. It was the cold, hard accounting of a woman who had reduced human beings to mere resources, commodities in her gruesome economy of survival. The journal was the most damning evidence of all, a window into a mind that had completely divorced itself from all moral and ethical constraints. It was the true testament of the Blackwood curse, a curse of pragmatism, of desperation taken to its most horrifying and logical conclusion. Sheriff Calloway took the journal. He knew it could never be made public. It was too inflammatory, too profoundly disturbing for a community already traumatized by war and loss. The official story would be simplified. Alara Blackwood was a murderer who, when cornered, took her own life and the lives of her children. The horrifying details of cannibalism, the ledger, the true nature of her survival would be buried. It was a truth too dark for the public record. The posse gathered everything from the cabin, the smokehouse, and the cellar: the bodies, the gruesome provisions, the pathetic pile of stolen belongings, and placed it all inside the cabin. They doused the structure with kerosene. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody-looking shadows across the hollow, Sheriff Calloway threw the torch. The cabin went up with a roar, the flames consuming the evidence of Alara Blackwood's horrifying reign. The men watched in silence as the pyre lit up the twilight, the fire a supposed act of purification. They believed they were cleansing the land, burning away the curse. But some things cannot be erased by fire. The story, even in its sanitized form, would live on, becoming a permanent scar on the local history. The hollow would forever be a place of dread, a forbidden zone on the map of the human psyche. The burning of the cabin was not the end of the story. It was, in many ways, just the beginning of the legend. In the years and decades that followed, the tale of the widow Blackwood morphed and twisted, reabsorbing the very supernatural elements that Jebediah Thorne had tried to strip away. The horrifying, documented truth was too much to bear, so the community fell back on the more palatable fiction of a curse. It was easier to believe that Alara had been a witch, a servant of some ancient evil, than to accept that a desperate mother was capable of such cold, calculated atrocities. Locals began to report strange occurrences in the scorched and empty hollow. They spoke of seeing a ghostly woman in a tattered dress moving through the trees at dusk, forever searching for more travelers to feed her spectral children. Others claimed to hear the phantom sounds of a cleaver striking a block, or the sorrowful cries of children on the wind. The site of the cabin became a place of morbid pilgrimage for some, and a place to be avoided at all costs by all sane people. The land itself was said to be tainted, and no one ever dared to build there again. The trees grew back, thick and tangled, swallowing the blackened patch of earth where the cabin once stood, but they could not swallow the memory. The story had seeped into the soil, becoming a permanent part of the landscape. What became of Jebediah Thorne? He collected a small bounty for closing the case of the missing peddler, but he found no satisfaction in it. The Blackwood case broke him. He had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back, leaving him a changed man. He quit his work as an investigator, unable to stomach any more of humanity's darkness. He took his money and moved west, hoping to outrun the memories that haunted his sleep. It is said he ended his days as a recluse in the mountains of Colorado, a quiet, haunted man who rarely spoke to anyone. He never again spoke of what he saw in that Tennessee hollow, but the ghosts of Alara, Silas, and Maeve followed him to his grave. Sheriff Calloway, too, was deeply affected. He held onto the widow's horrifying ledger for the rest of his life, keeping it locked away. It was found among his effects after his death, and his family, horrified by its contents, were rumored to have burned it, erasing the final written proof of Alara's crimes from the world forever. The posse of men who had accompanied him to the cabin never spoke of the full details of what they found inside. They carried the secret with them, a shared trauma that bound them in a silent, lifelong pact. They had looked upon the face of true horror, and it had left them permanently marked. The core of this entire macabre tale lies in a single, profoundly disturbing question. Was Alara Blackwood insane, or was she in some terrifying way the most rational person in the story? The war had created a world without rules, a landscape of pure Darwinian survival. In this context, her actions, while monstrous, possessed a chilling, undeniable logic. She identified a problem, starvation, and devised a brutally efficient solution. She saw a surplus of a resource, lone, vulnerable travelers, and she harvested it. The moral and ethical framework that governed civilized society had been obliterated by the war, and in its absence she created her own based on a single imperative, the preservation of her offspring. This is perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the case. It suggests that the line between civilization and savagery is terrifyingly thin. It implies that within even the most ordinary person, there lies a capacity for unimaginable acts, waiting for the right combination of desperation and opportunity to be unleashed. Was Alara a monster, or was she a mirror, reflecting the absolute darkest potential of the human will to survive? The story offers no easy answers, leaving us to grapple with the unsettling ambiguity. The curse was not a supernatural force, it was the terrifyingly logical endpoint of a world gone mad. Over time, the historical case file of Alara Blackwood became a ghost story, its sharp edges of fact worn smooth by decades of fearful retelling. It now exists in a gray space between history and folklore, a chilling campfire tale with a dark, verifiable core. It serves as a stark reminder of the hidden horrors that lie beneath the surface of our collective past, particularly during times of great upheaval like the American Civil War. The war is often remembered through its grand battles, its famous generals, and its political machinations. But for every story of battlefield glory, there are 1,000 untold stories of the civilians caught in the crossfire, of the quiet, desperate struggles that played out in isolated cabins and forgotten hollows. These are the stories of the true cost of war, a price paid not just in soldiers' lives, but in the corrosion of the human soul. The tale of the Widow Blackwood is a banned history, not by any official decree, but by a collective unwillingness to confront the depths of depravity that desperation can breed. It's a story that forces us to look at the uncomfortable truth of what we are capable of when the thin veneer of society is stripped away and survival becomes the only law. Today, if you were to venture into the remote hills of Tennessee and ask about the old Blackwood place, you would be met with guarded silence or a stern warning to stay away. The exact location of the hollow has been lost to time or perhaps deliberately forgot, but the story remains. It lingers in the air, a cautionary tale passed down through generations. It has become a permanent part of the region's identity, a dark secret that the mountains keep. The story serves as a chilling monument to the vanished, the men whose lives were reduced to a line in a gruesome ledger and a handful of personal trinkets in a dark cellar. It is a testament to the horrors that can unfold in the isolated pockets of the world, far from the eyes of the law and the judgment of society. And it is the final, horrifying legacy of a woman who, faced with an impossible choice, made a deal not with the devil, but with the most ruthless and pragmatic parts of her own human nature. She traded the flesh of strangers for the survival of her own, and in doing so, she became something more than a murderer. She became a permanent and terrifying fixture of American folklore. But one final, disturbing question hangs over this entire cold case. After the fire, after the legend took hold, stories occasionally surfaced of a woman and two quiet, watchful children seen in other parts of the country. A family fitting their description was briefly noted in a Missouri settlement in the 1870s, before they vanished again after a local trapper disappeared. Another possible sighting was reported in the rugged mining camps of Colorado a decade later, a place where lone men with pockets full of gold often went missing without a trace. These are likely nothing more than ghost stories, echoes of a powerful legend. The evidence of the bodies in the cabin seems irrefutable, but the official report written by Sheriff Calloway was brief and lacked detail, and the bodies were consumed by the fire, leaving only charred bone fragments for burial. Is it possible that the horrifying tableau the posse found was itself a deception? A final, brilliant piece of misdirection from a master of the craft? Could Alara have found 3 other victims, dressed them in her family's clothes, and staged the scene to fake their deaths, allowing her and her children to escape and continue their horrifying way of life elsewhere? It is a deeply unsettling thought, and one for which there is no evidence. Yet the question lingers, a final, creepy layer to an already macabre tale. It ensures that the case of the Widow Blackwood will never truly be closed. Ultimately, we are left with the chilling echo of her story. Whether she died in that cabin or vanished into the vast, lawless expanse of the American West, Alara Blackwood's legacy is one of profound and disturbing questions. It forces us to confront the nature of good and evil, sanity and madness, and the terrifying elasticity of the human spirit. The curse of the Widow Blackwood was not one of witchcraft or demons. It was the curse of memory, the curse of a story so horrifying that it refuses to die. It remains buried in the Tennessee hills, a cold case that is forever frozen in time, a testament to a period when a nation's war against itself created monsters in the most unexpected of places. And it serves as a permanent, chilling reminder that sometimes, the most terrifying forbidden histories are not found in ancient tomes or forgotten ruins, but in the quiet, desperate acts of ordinary people pushed to the absolute edge of survival. The hollow is quiet now, but if you listen closely, some say you can still hear the wind whispering through the trees, telling the creepy, macabre, and unending story of the widow who traded flesh to survive.